If you think of a tank, you usually picture something like this, or maybe this. All with central turrets, but there were also tanks with rear turrets, and they were, without a doubt, impressive feats of engineering. Most of them were truly competent tanks, and many were far superior to their conventional counterparts. There were beautiful examples like the Panzerjäger Elephant, a huge tank destroyer with an 88mm cannon, or even the Israeli Merkava tanks. Another good example of an armored vehicle with a rear turret, or how about the Argentine TAM series from the 1970s. However, nowadays, only one model of this type of tank exists, and even that only sort of counts. They seem to have gradually disappeared after World War II, until almost none were left. But to begin with, why did tanks with rear turrets exist? What are the benefits of this layout? And if they were so good, why are there almost no armored fighting vehicles with this type anymore? In fact, the rear turret configuration was actually an accident. In 1941, when Henschel and Porsche were competing for the contract to manufacture the Tiger I, Porsche was quite confident with its prototype model, the Tiger P, which had the turret much farther forward than Henschel's Tiger. Before the contract was awarded to either company, Porsche manufactured 100 chassis of the P model so that when the contract was given, they could present vehicles as soon as possible. However, Henschel and its centered turret model won the contract, leaving Porsche with 100 huge abandoned chassis. It was no small matter. The manufacturing cost of each chassis would be equivalent to $1.5 million today. So Porsche wouldn't discard a single one of those chassis, and they began developing a heavy tank destroyer to replace the old Mater 2 and 3, the heavy Panzerjäger. Why did it have a rear turret? It's not the same to create a custom chassis for what you need as it is to adapt an existing chassis for your needs, and Porsche's chassis were quite problematic. To make the ultimate tank destroyer, they wanted to equip it with the Pak 43, the most powerful cannon that existed in Germany at that time. The problem was that this cannon was so heavy that when the vehicle braked, it would dig into the ground, and it was so long that when the vehicle went over a bump, the same thing happened, it would get buried in the ground. The nose-diving tendency was problematic. It damaged the suspension and also the tracks. But the solution was quite simple. Switch the position of the engine and the turret, putting the turret at the back and the engine in the center, and this unexpectedly gave the armored vehicle incredible advantages. As we mentioned, tanks usually have the turret in the center. In this configuration, a very practical center of mass is maintained, but this setup, although standardized, has its disadvantages. For example, the weight distribution is problematic. It might seem that having the turret in the center would make the weight balanced, but that's not really the case. In tanks, the goal is to have very thick frontal armor, because that's where shots are usually concentrated. When you added that to a huge and heavy cannon, there were problems. You caused the famous forward pitching, making it so that when the tank braked or went over a bump, it tended to lurch forward. The engine is usually used as a counterweight in these cases, but many times it wasn't enough. Vehicles like the Jagdpanzer IV suffered from this problem, which earned it the nickname Guderian's Duck. Having the engine in the back was also more demanding mechanically. You have a transmission that's very far from the engine, so well, you had to have a long drive shaft and a whole drivetrain system to connect both forces. For this, you had to make the tank a little higher. The problem with the length of the barrel not only affected the weight, but also directly the dimensions of the vehicle. Vehicles with a central turret are limited to having barrels that aren't too long, because if they were too long, they would hit the ground every time they went over a bump. Tanks with a rotating turret can turn the barrel backwards, but if you made a tank destroyer, this was a serious problem. The rear turret design solved all these problems. To begin with, by having the turret at the back, the vehicle could have a barrel as long as it wanted, without many consequences. The barrel wouldn't hit the ground in potholes, nor would it affect the vehicle's weight balance. These were problems that vehicles with a central turret did have. You could also add as much frontal armor as you wanted. In fact, the more frontal armor the vehicle had, the better, because it gave the armored vehicle a much better center of mass. The crew was also considerably safer, or at least most of the crew. Any frontal shot would be absorbed by the engine, meaning that most of the crew wouldn't be affected, and forget about the Soviets throwing Molotov cocktails at the engine. If someone tried it, well, that's what the front machine gun was for. The only disadvantage was that the driver was separated from the rest of the crew, and in the middle they had a huge noisy engine, so communication was only possible through intercoms. In this way, the elephant solved its balance problems and, unintentionally, the Germans created a new way of making armored vehicles. There were many models that used this philosophy throughout World War II or even during the 20th century. The VK BK4502P was Porsche's prototype model for the Tiger II, which used this technology. But unfortunately, it lost to Henschel's prototype and never went into production. The Archer was another vehicle that had a rear-mounted turret. It was a tank destroyer vehicle that used the same philosophy, and this one was quite successful. The Zuzian M was also a Soviet prototype, but it appeared in the 1950s. It was a tank destroyer, so it didn't go into production because the concept was already a bit obsolete by that time. The Argentine TAM series is another family that went into production in the 1970s and used this configuration, and this one was a huge success in the Andean nation. And finally, there's the Israeli Merkava, a tank that takes advantage of the extra space to incorporate a multi-purpose design. It can carry infantry or extra ammunition. And it's perhaps the only production MBT tank with this configuration. The concept of a rear-mounted turret itself hasn't disappeared. It's just that it's not so necessary except for some particular cases like the Merkava, which required improved storage space. Almost the same thing happened to this concept as to muzzle brakes, which we saw just a few weeks ago. Nowadays, an MBT tank cannon doesn't have to be so long to be effective. Composite armor isn't as heavy as the thick sheets of homogeneous armor that were used in World War II. And even modern suspensions are much better than before, making it so any imbalance can be easily corrected by modern suspensions. The only advantage of this paradigm that could be useful today would be the extra space you get in the back, which can be useful, but setting up the whole vehicle just for this feature is not at all cost-effective in an MBT tank. However, there are a number of armored vehicles that can't leave this concept behind, and of course, we're talking about self-propelled artillery. These vehicles need very long cannons to have greater range. If they had a central turret, they wouldn't be able to go over any bump without burying the nose in the ground. And these vehicles make very good use of the space in the back to carry plenty of ammunition. If you like this video channel, I recommend you watch this one about why muzzle brakes disappeared. Thank you for watching this video and goodbye.